unseen, where shadows play. Tune in, let's drift away.
Midnight whispers on the airwaves, ghostly echoes from hidden graves. Tune your mind to the spectral sounds where Bigfoot roams and the mystery abounds. Chasing lights in the midnight sky, UFOs land and watch them fly. Paranormal truths wrapped in disguise, where the seekers no need to be shy. Take a ride with us into the unknown. Midnight frequency radio, where wild tales are grown. Aliens calling, hear the echo of the past. Time travel dreams.
From the Ozark foothills of northeast Arkansas, I'm Carl Richardson, and this is Midnight Frequency Radio. Our guest tonight is Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. Dr. Jeff Meldrum is a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at the Idaho State University. His research centers on the evolution of hominin bipedalism. His professional interest in the footprints attributed to Sasquatch began when he personally examined a line of 15-inch tracks in the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington in 1996. Nearly 30 years later, his lab houses well over 300 footprints cast attributed to relic humanoids around the world. Dr. Meldrum has conducted collaborative laboratory and field research throughout the world and has shared his findings in numerous popular and professional publications and presentations, interviews, and television appearances. Dr. Meldrum is author of Sasquatch, Legends Meet Science, which explores the contemporary scientific evidence for the reality of this legendary species, and also affords difference to tribal peoples' traditional knowledge of this subject. In addition, he has published 2 field guides, one focusing on Sasquatch, the second casting the net more broadly to consider the potential of relic humanoid species around the world. He is author-in-chief of the scholarly reference journal, The Relic Humanoid Inquiry, now in its 14th year. Dr. Meldrum, good evening and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation.
Your bio is a mouthful.
Yeah, we may have probably should have done a dry run on that.
Well, actually, I read it 3 or 4 times earlier, but you know how that
Oh,
goes.
did you?
But
Well, those are some of the terms we should probably explore then this evening.
yes, sir. How did your scientific background lead you to the exploration of Bigfoot?
Well, the seeds of interest in this particular topic were planted quite early on. I was a youngster living in Spokane, Washington, when Roger Patterson first took his sort of homespun documentary featuring the 60 seconds of footage on the road. One of his first stops was Spokane. So as a young 5th grader, about 11 years old, I convinced my dad that we should go to this. He and I and my younger brother of 2.5 years went and were right on the 3rd row center seat. And it was impressive. I mean, to see that film with its various depictions, slow motion and stop action and so forth, larger than life, literally on that big silver screen in front of us was really amazing. I mean, it just captivated me. So that was always rattling around there and resonated with my clear interests in natural history and all things relating to biology. You know, I was always had a real menagerie of animals, insects, and snakes, reptiles, and little wayward mammals. I had a baby prairie dog, or a pocket gopher, I guess, more not a prairie dog per se, but anyway, stray animals were finding their way home, and so academic interests kind of bounced around in that area. It was funny. Someone actually was quite amused, apparently, to learn that I came, just that close to a career in carpentry. All through high school and college, I worked as a on either a framing crew or as a finish carpenter doing the finished woodwork or cabinet making and cabinet installation and so on. And just about went into that as a livelihood were it not for a recession that hit and the building industry dried up. So it seemed like a good idea maybe to take advantage of a scholarship I'd been offered and go to school for a couple of years and see what that turned up. And my interest in one of those youthful aspirations, career aspirations, was veterinary medicine, and that became more and more a real possibility. And I did my 200 hours of volunteer work in a local veterinary clinic over one summer, and really enjoyed small animal practice. Although I was more intrigued, if I had pursued that route, I would have done my utmost to have made it into exotic animal zoo veterinary medicine. Anyway, but all that was within the much broader, grander framework of the natural sciences, and so it was an easy shift to emphasis from non-human animals to more human-like animals, if not humans themselves. And I became fascinated with the fossil record of human evolution, and especially the emergence of our habit of walking on two legs. While I was an undergraduate, there was a seminal paper published on the locomotor anatomy of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species, I should say. And this was a time when new fossils were coming to light that shed new light, new insights into the emergence of that rather, for a long time thought to be entirely distinctive habit of walking on two legs. Although now we recognize a number of other primate, ape-like species during the Miocene that exhibited some inclinations for walking on two legs. And of course, again, rattling around the back of my mind were still these stories of Bigfoot and Yeti, and having read Ivan Sanderson's book, the possibility of other relic hominoids. He didn't use that term. He coined a funny little acronym, ABSM, short for abominable snowmen, to designate these non-human, upright walking, man-like creatures around the world in various corners of the globe. So it wasn't a huge shift for me to kind of realign my focus of interest and start pursuing graduate work first in animal locomotion, vertebrate locomotion generally, but then also human biomechanics. I was at Brigham Young University, and they had a very good biomechanics kinesiology program that the professors there were always intrigued by my interests in in hominin bipedalism, and so so that's where I went. I pursued that to the State University of New York at Stony Brook, that had an excellent program. I think one of the best in the country at the time. I was very fortunate to be offered a position there, to have earned a position there, and benefited from the tutelage of some really great professors that were very research active, publishing, had access to fossil specimens and museum collections, and it really afforded a great opportunity to look at this and lay the foundation so that when the opportunity presented itself to sort of revisit this question of other, as yet unrecognized species of bipedal primate, I was in an excellent position to evaluate that evidence, to have something insightful, something knowledgeable to say, not just expressing an opinion, but drawing conclusions based on lots and lots of observation, lots and lots of comparative data, and so in this case, the thing that really set the hook was a set of footprints. I was shown a set of footprints that were just right between 14 and 15 inches in length, a long line. It was an exceptional example. And this is just one of many examples where things just kind of were laid out in front of me. It's almost uncanny with 2020 hindsight to look at it, but I joke, it's kind of like my experience with fishing. I really enjoy fishing. I enjoy eating fish far more than I enjoy fishing, actually, which is the motivation. But I don't have a lot of patience. I have to cultivate that virtue. When it came to fishing, if I didn't have any success in short order, I would have to pull up stakes and search for greener pastures. But if I caught a fish, boy, then I could stay focused on that spot for hours and hours and hours. So it was very fortuitous that my first real encounter with, firsthand with some footprint evidence was an exceptional case with 35, 45 clear footprints in this very fine, silty, wet loess, this glacial silt that is part of the the soils across southeastern Washington and all across southern Idaho. A feature that I'm very familiar with down here in southeastern Idaho, gives rise to so much dust. But because of the extremely fine particulate nature, like when a road is put in or when the soil is tilled in agricultural, lands, the texture is such that remarkably clear footprints. It was from this region that the first published acknowledgement of dermatoglyphics came from, and no coincidence. It was because of the fact that the substrate lent itself to picking up that kind of detail. And then Paul Freeman was a good enough caster of footprints that he didn't obliterate all of the fine detail that was in some of these tracks, especially when in wet, clayey soil that would hold its shape, its consistency, even under the weight of a plaster, pour.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, these tracks were so fresh, so clear. As I knelt down beside them, I could see dermatoglyphics in many of them. It was stunning. I mean, it was amazing. And the animation, the signs of, Paul had tried to sort of dissuade me not to get my hopes up. He said, these tracks are good, but he said they're not perfect. I wouldn't bother casting them. He said, anymore, I have so many casts that unless it's a really exceptional example, I don't even bother. Well, the things that he considered as imperfections were all the signs of animation. They were the tension cracks and the pressure ridges and the partial imprint of some of the extended toes and the drag outs of the toes at the head of the track. Some were inundated with water in such a way that the details, the contours, the topography, the angle of step, and so forth was all amazing. You could read what had actually transpired right there. Basically, I reconstructed it, which was different than Paul. Paul, I mean, he was a good tracker, but he had read it. I don't, for whatever reason, had read the scene completely wrong, which in a way was interesting because had he been responsible for laying down these tracks, you'd think he would have gotten the scenario, the sequence of events right, but he had it completely backwards. But I think that a Sasquatch had been traveling down through the riverine gallery forest there along the Mill Creek, was following the growth in the brush along the irrigation ditches. Was probably This was in February, so the snows had just melted off the foothills. There was fallow grain fields and stubble and such, but there were also in some of these little box canyons, box valleys, right up against the steeper parts, the uncultivated parts, there were abandoned orchards, plum and apple orchards. And I think that it was down there gleaning some of this frozen fruit, thawing out. And this would have also been the first weekend that you could negotiate this steep hill that as this thing circled back around to head up Black Snake Ridge towards the watershed and the wilderness area beyond, this would have been the first night someone could have taken a four-wheel drive up that grade and, partied or had a bonfire, who knows what. And I think they were returning in the wee hours of the morning, and this creature was confronted by headlights, probably. This is me recreating the scenario, because it suddenly literally wheeled around. You can see it in the footprints, and began walking briskly back towards the only cover that was available, which was the tall brush along that wasn't cropped down completely along the irrigation ditch some distance away. And every second right step was angled out 45 degrees as it looked over its shoulder to assess the progress of these headlights, I'm imagining, or whatever, coming down the hillside. And then I think it realized it wasn't going to make it at that pace, and it took off running. And there was one of these tracks where the dynamic is so clear. You can see it was angled out 45 degrees, but then clearly decided to take off. It pivoted back to the left, and then the forefoot slid, the toes digging in back across the midfoot, and left these long tracks of the toes. And then the step length doubled as it left just half tracks running with its heel up into the cover of the brush, running across the fallow field, with its very soft substrate. And so the tracks were impressed quite deeply along that stretch. And then they were lost. It probably jumped down into the the irrigation canal there. But anyway, so it was amazing. I mean, the fact that we can sit and talk about this, and clearly, as I pointed out, details of anatomy and of dynamics, the animation that was so evident, you could just tell. Not that it was lost on him, but there was not the recognition that, if he had planted these things and was seeking affirmation from me as the gullible pawn, that wasn't the case at all. It was more like when I'm explaining something quite technical to a student and they kind of get it, but not quite, and that expression on their face of a little bit of bewilderment, he certainly was not responsible for that. So yeah, it was all the more amazing. So the hook was set. That was the beginning where I literally had this little conversation, as I've often recounted. It's much kind of like two little imps, one on each shoulder.
Yeah.
And the one saying, because I'd just come from Dr. Krantz's lab. And I was always, ever since I had read his books, was aware of his career and interest in this subject. I was also very conscious of the ridicule that he endured, the flack. And in his own book, he talks, rather cynically about the scientific establishment and his mistreatment and being passed over for promotion for years, and et cetera, things that I can relate to personally now with having reached this point as well. But the one little imp saying, "You really want to do this? You really want to get involved with this?" And the other imp's going, "Look at this evidence. Look at these tracks. I mean, how can you? A Sasquatch actually walked by here last night. You know that now. How could you walk away from this?" Of course, it's clear which imp won out the the debate.
Yeah. My
Yeah.
apologies. My husky came into the
Oh, no.
studio, and I
Yeah,
want to.
yeah.
Do you have a set of criteria that you use when you assess the credibility of the footprint cast, or any other physical evidence?
Well, sure. I mean, there are lots and lots of factors involved, and each case, because it's not like we're pulling a static bone out of a museum drawer and slapping calipers on it to take a series of measurements. We're dealing with the documentation of a very dynamic process, and the cast represents a snapshot that is a composite of the entire step process, which in turn, which it incorporates all the dynamics of that behavior, but also remember a footprint is a record of the interaction, that dynamic process with the substrate. And so the conditions of the substrate have tremendous influence on the appearance. So I'm looking for a number of things. I mean, there are some very fundamental distinctions between a Sasquatch footprint, say, and a human, for example, or the other likely misapprehended candidate would be a bear, another animal whose hind foot is largely plantigrade and pentadactyl, five-toed. And so, as compared to all the other animals that are out there in the woods, which have, four toes like the canids and felids, or, unless we're looking at smaller animals like a raccoon or a possum, that have a more prehensile foot. And then you get to the unguligrades, the ungulates, the hoofed animals, and there you have typically two. We don't have many one-hoofed wild animals, just the horse in the pasture in the barnyard. But wild pigs, wild deer, deer family, and so forth have hooves. They walk up on their nails, their
Yeah.
modified nails, unguligrades. So basically, we're trying to rule out, is it a footprint versus just an artifact, a pothole, a puddle, a blob of snow that's fallen from the tree into the snowfield. Um, and then if it is a footprint, is it human or is it a bear as opposed to a Sasquatch? And so again, we look at very distinctive characteristics with the human. Uh, Humans typically have a normal range of breadth to length ratio. They have a well differentiated ball and heel pad because of a longitudinal arch that places weight at the fore and aft ends of that arch support. They have a rather distinctive configuration of toes. Most people, at least around here, most people spend most of their life in confining their feet in shoes. And so the toes show the consequences of that. A very, ready tell is a little toe that's literally pushed in and almost turned on its side. So that the nail, what's left of a nail, many of us have very little nail there to clip on any regular basis, points almost directly lateral instead of upward. And that's a immediate giveaway if the toes have that appearance. If it's a bear, then the toes have kind of a parabolic distribution, an arch distribution across. The central three are usually quite webbed, and so they kind of look like a triplet. Three nice oval pads that are quite close together, not a lot of splay, but more play in the fifth, which is often the longest or may appear to be the biggest because of that play. Kind of rolls a little bit. And it's the bear's inner toe, what we call on the human foot, the big toe, is not so big in a bear. It looks more like a thumb. It's shorter. It just as our big toe has just two phalanges, two bones, as opposed to the other digits, which have three. And so it's a little bit shorter. So it almost looks like the bear's walking with its feet crossed. like a catwalk model with a real cross step. But but then, of course, the other complication with the bear is they're quadrupeds, not bipeds. They walk on four legs, not two, and their forepaw has a very distinctive abbreviated shape, much as if we walked on our hands, if our fingers were much shorter, like the digits on a bear. Bear often show claws, not always. That's not a foolproof method of identifying, but bears can dig for their food and wear their claws down through use, especially in the springtime. But sometimes the substrate doesn't pick up the contact with the claws very clearly, doesn't preserve it as well. I've had many an experienced hunter show me a footprint, and they were just convinced it had to be a Sasquatch because there were no claw marks, no visible claw marks, and they weren't willing to acknowledge all the other characteristics, the other 8 or 9 that clearly made it a bear,
Yeah.
and acknowledge the fact that claws are not the only. So there, again, it's not really rocket science. There's a certain art, a certain knack that you can develop with practice and familiarity, so that an understanding of the underlying anatomy, the distinction, so that you can interpret the impression in the ground. But I try when people send me tracks on a weekly basis. I mean, at least 2 or 3 or 4 examples, and they fall into those categories I mentioned. Some are just innocuous, ambiguous, unidentifiable potholes. Probably not a footprint at all. In some cases, it's quite clear there is no anatomy to be observed. It's just a divot. And then, like I said, many others are of either human, and that's further complicated with the popularity of toed running shoes now, which have confused observers on some occasions. Usually, the tread and the logos on the tread of the running shoe are distinct enough that they show up under better conditions of soil, of substrate.
Yeah.
But the other one that I've gotten, this is just to add one last little thought here, that because I've had literally in the last 3 weeks, I've had 2 examples sent to me, and this also goes to a feature that is often really grossly overstated when it comes to Sasquatch tracks. First of all, a long line of tracks, such as I witnessed, as I alluded to, is really unusual. It's not very often that you have circumstances where there is sufficient substrate and the inclination of the track maker to follow that substrate for any considerable distance. So oftentimes we are unfortunately dealing with maybe 1 or 2 very clear footprints. Now, a good tracker, someone who has really mastered the art of tracking it, and there's a difference between, someone like a Jim Halfpenny or a Paul Resendez or a Baker that where you supposedly can follow a mouse across a cement driveway from the little overturned pebbles and so forth, which I find I'm a little incredulous about. But
Yeah.
I mean, the following the little overturned stones and the bent blades of grass or the snapped twigs that have been stepped on, that is a real skill that borders on rocket science, in my opinion,
Yeah.
that you have to really practice and really hone that skill. But on the other hand, if there's a clear footprint to be seen, I can interpret it on the basis of the anatomy, sometimes much better than the skilled tracker who hasn't been exposed to that aspect of the footprints to the depth that I have. It's like one time I was kind of challenged on my opinion, my interpretation, and I said, well, my opinion, I said, excuse me, You don't think you're going to equate your opinion with mine unless you have also dissected hundreds of human cadaveric feet or dissected dozens of great ape feet, dozens of monkey feet. That unless you have spent hours observing primates locomoting, taking video, turning those into, diagrams and tracings, that you've done track beds, that you've done x-rays, when you've done all of that, then you can equate your opinion with my conclusions that are drawn upon years of scientific investigation. I said there's a very real difference, and this is why sometimes I butt heads. Some may know Joel Harden was a Washington State Border Patrol tracker, and who was called in by the Forest Service to offer his assessment of some of the tracks that Paul Freeman had found. And he concluded that they were human, that they were almost certainly hoaxed.
Yeah.
Well, when you read his report, it's quite revealing. He looks at these tracks and all tracks through the lens of one trained in man tracking. He doesn't know the distinctions that are associated with, say, the fossilized footprints of the flat, flexible foot of an Australopithecine. He's never dissected the musculature and ligaments of this spectrum of subject that I alluded to before. He's not looked at radiographs. He's not looked at the joints. He's not done, osteoligamentous preps to quantify the range of motion of each joint in the foot. I mean, it just hasn't. That's not part of that training.
Yeah.
And there aren't many people who are afforded the opportunity, as I have, to have access to those kinds of materials to do that very thing. So I go through his list of all these things that he's noted while looking through the lens of a man tracker, and he argues for things that were inconsistent with a human trackway. For example, there wasn't the topography with differential pressure beneath the foot and the ball. Well, no, because it walks with a flat, flexible foot, not an arched foot. He noted that when it went up an incline, that the step length was remarkably consistent, even when there was an increase in the inclination of the slope. Well, that's because it's walking not with a stiff-legged gait, maximizing step length, which can't be maintained on an incline, but with a compliant gait that smooths out the differences between walking on the flat versus walking up a slope and down a slope. So the point, without belaboring it, every single point of his report in which he criticized these as being hoaxed, as being inconsistent with what he expected in a man track, are exactly the features that I would expect in the contrasting nature of a Sasquatch. Big, heavy biped walking on flat, flexible feet with a remarkably thick sole pad and a compliant gait with flexed hips and ankles and knees. I mean, that's that's the difference.
Yeah.
So much depends on your point of view that he was just barking up the wrong tree. And in fact, by his observations, he made it quite clear that what we were dealing with was not a human hoaxer. It
Yeah.
was something else altogether. So anyway, I've never had the chance to meet him and discuss these things. I published some remarks and reactions to his early report I think it was in one of the issues of Daniel Perez's Bigfoot Times newsletter, just to get it out there and get the conversation. And then he published his book and devoted a whole chapter to the Bigfoot tracks. And I have been meaning to write a review of his book to get published, in one of these outlets. But and I would go into much more detail into that particular chapter, especially, obviously, but haven't had the chance yet.
Yeah.
And it's kind of disappeared into the sunset. I don't think, his I don't think his chapter has had a huge influence on a lot of people, and even those who are familiar with the history and the evidence from the Blue Mountains outside of Wall. I mean, it's a fascinating place.
Yes, sir.
It's an exceptional place because of the nature of the substrate, combined with the fact that until recently, especially, I mean, it's changing as more improvements are made to some of those Forest Service roads. But for the longest time, when in my first years, decades there, the roads were tertiary roads. They were just graded roads, no gravel improvements, which was great for someone. It makes it challenging when the weather is not great, and it's also problematic up there. The snowdrifts can linger well into late July, where you can't get around the north sides of some of those high roads, and limits your access. But it has produced an inordinate number of footprints, an inordinate number of cases of repeat appearances of recognizable individuals because of the high number of footprints. I mean, the only other place that has even come close were the real dusty and newly bulldozed roads around Bluff Creek back in the 50s, 60s. And there we have numerous repeat appearances of individuals. I mean, it's just documentation of repeat
Yeah.
appearances. Besides the documentation, and you have to have someone there and it makes sense. If
Yes,
you've
sir.
got a limited number of individuals, and I maintain they're extremely rare in a given geographical area where footprints are found repeatedly, then the odds of those repeated discoveries of footprints representing one of a few individuals is much higher than, when you have herds of deer and elk and things like that in large numbers. And you can recognize those feet based on their proportions, based on the toe configuration, and it's a remarkable testament. And because then the devil's advocate would immediately step up and say, "Oh, well, yeah, those are just because they're tracks made by the same stompers that are dusted off every few years." Well, if that were the case, yes, it'd be very straightforward to take a photograph or a cast of one and put it alongside another and see that yes, they don't vary. I mean, we did this exercise when in smaller scale when Cliff Berrickman had cast literally hundreds of the London trackway, a case where there were long trackway on a drawn down reservoir, artificial lake. Then in the mudflats there were just long lines of tracks as something traversed these mudflats, and so he got lots and lots and lots of casts, and he carefully photographed them on a gridded background, and then had those photographs on a CD, and on a visit to my lab brought that with him, and we sat in front of the computer together and went through picture. We did a frame by frame side by side, and went through picture by picture by picture, and looking to see if we could find a single example where the distance between the toe tips varied any. And in that what 120 casts he has, not a single divergence. They all lined up. I mean, the only differences were due to depth or distortion due to the imprint of the false foot into the sloppier areas of the mud.
Yes, sir.
But as far as demonstrating any animation, any mobility of the toes, zero examples. That's pretty condemning
Yes.
observation.
Yeah.
Pretty certain that they're a static prosthetic foot. stomper. So, we have multiple examples from the blues, for example, where you can see pressure ridges, you can see toe splay, you can see, as in the case of mine, this is why it was so clear that they couldn't have been stompers. In some instances, the toes are extended where it's walking on the flat, when it took off running, those toes dug in, they flexed really tightly and impressed so deeply in the mud that you could actually see a side profile of the digit and see all three segments and the joints between indicated, and the flexion creases and so forth as the toe kind of abducted and pressed into the sidewall of this, 2-inch deep imprint. Um, Lots of animation, lots of mobility in the toes and flexibility of the midfoot, half tracks and pressure ridges and toe slides and so forth. It was just, like I said, they do exist.
Yeah.
It was a real aha moment.
In your book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, you critique the
Mhm.
dismissal of Sasquatch evidence. Why do you think the mainstream media is still so resistant, or that mainstream science?
Well, the mainstream, well, yes, and there's an important distinction there. And sometimes one influences the other, and you hope it's usually the science influencing the media, but science, this was something that puzzled me. I mean, I was aware of the treatment that Dr. Krantz received, and I knew that Dr. Krantz was a bit of a maverick. He was considered, even if you go back to Sanderson, Sanderson had a reputation. He was all into Fortean topics, and so one of the books that also fascinated me that he had written was that I'm trying to remember now, In Pursuit of Mysteries, I think it was, which I read several times, which had both, biological entities, but also archaeological phenomenon and different things relating to UFOs and so on, and ancient astronauts kind of themes. So it was, but because of that, see, when he talks about ABSMs, it just gets lumped in with everything else. It's kind of one of the unfortunate consequences of roping the subject of Sasquatch under the umbrella of cryptozoology. Cryptozoology has always been the ugly stepsister that, the Cinderella was never afforded a place at the table. It was an illegitimate pseudoscience, a fringe science. If even that, if it even earned the moniker science. So I knew I was aware of that, but I thought, um, still, why? I mean, I didn't have that reputation. And when I brought this evidence to the table, the altar, if you will, uh, it didn't um, it didn't have the impact I expected, didn't have the reception. And then as I started contemplating and digging deeper, I tell my students this, you always have to consider ideas, especially controversial ones, against the backdrop of what is conventional wisdom at that time. What is the current paradigm? And back when I was an undergraduate student, Thomas Kuhn's book, Scientific Revolutions, was making all kinds of ripples and all kinds of discussion, because people were, I mean, it sort of chipped away a little bit at this uh, perception that science was this unassailable edifice that, that only truth is uttered there. It just, no, I mean, if you're a student of, and this is why it's important to teach the history of science. When we don't do that with students, then as they say, those who don't learn from history, what are bound to repeat it. They make the same mistakes, and so um, if you're aware of history, you know that there has constantly been shifts in paradigms, and sometimes it's as what's his name? Oh, I just went blank from Jurassic Park, the mathematician. Sometimes discovery can be a violent process. And Malcolm.
Yeah.
And so in contemplating that, see, I came in just at a time, right on the cusp of a shift in paradigm. And in the 60s, heyday in the 60s, and casting its shadow forward over the 70s was what was called the single species hypothesis. This was a notion where the niche concept, which had of ecology, which had in turn been internalized from the competitive exclusion principle from microbiology, the notion that there could, a creature can make a living in one way, but only one species can do that. Otherwise, if there's competition, one will do it better than the other and drive the other to extinction eventually, or drive the engine of evolution, and there is character displacement or niche partitioning. But there's got to be some way to reduce competition between the species. Well, anthropologists looked at that and thought, well, the hominin niche, our human ancestors and close relatives, since the divergence with the other tailless apes, the chimpanzees in particular, our closest ally, that evolution, or excuse me, that evolution is occurs in a rather exclusive niche that is increasing brain size, tool use, material culture, and bipedalism, the habit of walking on two legs. And so there can be only one, you know, to borrow another movie line, there can be only one. And so human hominin evolution, even from its earlier emergence from the adaptive radiation of great apes, was seen as this single file, single species process, one continuous species with, morphospecies or chronospecies along the way, one giving rise to the next, giving and supplanting, giving rise to another, and so forth in succession. But it was a single file process. So there could be only one. And we are it currently. So there can't be Bigfoot. There can't be Yeti. There can't be orang pendek. There can't be a Yowie. There can't be these non-human bipedal hominids. Just can't be. Doesn't fit the model. Doesn't fit the paradigm. Well, now that paradigm fell apart in the 70s and 80s, and as more and more fossils in Africa and elsewhere were discovered, and that single file march now turned into an adaptive radiation, a bushy tree with lots and lots of contemporaneous branches, and intriguingly, the stuff of headlines, species persisting until remarkably recent times. So you've got sites of Neanderthal occupation that are suggested to be 10,000 years old, even though most texts we know say they went extinct between 23, 32,000 years ago. You've got Homo erectus in Southeast Asia, some of the islands like Java, possibly as young as 25,000. You've got a Homo heidelbergensis outside of Beijing that I had the privilege of looking at, examining, because it has remarkably complete foot skeletons that tentatively is dated between 12 and 20,000 years ago. These creatures were walking alongside Homo sapiens for probably 50 plus thousand years in East Asia. And on and on, the orang pendek, the Homo floresiensis, when it was discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores. Initially, the date was somewhere between 13 and 18,000. Now that's been pushed back a little bit further to about 50,000. But still, 50,000. I mean, this is, you could take a time machine back, go back 50,000 years, step out in East Asia, and there's any of at least a half a dozen different hominins you might bump into along the way across the landscape. So the paradigm changed. It went from a single file, single species hypothesis to now, I like to call it the multi-species, the persistent multi-species hypothesis. And you can't say they can't exist like it was uttered previously. I mean, some people still say it, but you can't defend it. You cannot say they can't exist, therefore they don't. You can you can question the probability that such a creature, or a living creature, let alone the remains. I mean, the remains have been discovered of fairly recent vintage, but the you can argue that the likelihood, the probability that such a species might exist under our noses is pretty meager, pretty slight, not very convincing, especially in the absence of some bones or some teeth, a skull, or a living specimen.
Yeah.
So so that's kind of where we find ourselves. I think that's why science basically turns it back around. And in spite of this evidence, I mean, that's what someone actually said to me and a co-author, not to our faces, but to our backs. They can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and then added this. And therefore it doesn't matter what evidence they think they have. When does evidence not matter? Well, when you're not scientific. That's about that's about how it boils down, you know. Michael Shermer used to love to say, show me the body. Once you have a body, then the science starts. And I can't imagine a more inane statement. The science starts as soon as you ask a question that will lend itself to testing or to observation. That's it. How you address the question, how you generate and test hypotheses. That's when the science starts. You know,
Yeah.
the body is the conclusive evidence, sure, but we're supposed to say it's like I was. You're getting a whole bunch of stuff here, but I was taken to task by one of my nemesises on. Well, I don't really have a nemesis. One of my detractors on campus, who was an instructor in the physics department. And of course, he was a devotee of Michael Shermer and loved to rehearse that line. The science starts once you have a body. This individual also wrote a fairly regular column in our local newspaper, uh, which isn't saying much, but he had an opinion on everything. And I, though, was an easy target, and so a frequent subject of his columns. And so one time he was taking pot shots. So I wrote back and I said, it really amuses me that, oh, and I think one of the reasons I was a little more incensed is that his department chair in the physics department jumped on board and wrote his own letter to the editor berating me. I said, it's kind of rich that two physicists are here on this soapbox about the science starts once you have a body. Let me see. Show me an atom. Show me a string. Show me a black hole. Show me a quark. I go, your whole, much of your discipline, at least of theoretical physics, note the name, relies on the discussion of phenomenon for which you have no body. There is no corpus delicti, but rather you're measuring the influence, you're measuring the trace of its existence, its interaction with the surrounding environment. I said, doesn't that sound kind of like what I'm doing as well? The footprints are the trace, the eyewitness encounters are interacting, observations of behavior and anatomies and so forth, hair, scat. I just you're a kettle calling the pot black. It just doesn't hold up, and that kind of shut it down a bit.
Yeah.
They're both one's retired and one had gone to another university, so I don't hear from them anymore. But most people, I mean, the editor of the paper loved it because tons and tons of people would write in response. So that meant readership.
Yeah.
And so he loved it. He would trot out things on a regular basis, even not contemporary. items to stir the pot a little bit every once in a while. And I didn't mind it. It's stimulates conversation, gets people thinking. But many came to my defense. Not that I need their defense, but I mean it was gratifying that they were not duped by this inane, illogical position that these physicists had adopted. And anyway, I
Yes.
mean, again, just also the ridiculously that these two physicists were going to tutor me in the analysis of footprints. It's like, I mean, I know my place. Obviously, they don't know
Yeah,
theirs.
definitely. And I've seen
Yeah,
this amongst other people, like some of my past guests. Just the opposition is like you say, it's sometimes nutty.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I always try. I mean, I can find myself on a particular side of an argument, and I try to always reflect and on these kinds of experiences, and so that I make a conscious effort to be not sympathetic, but to be empathetic to different points of view, and ask myself, so where are they coming from? What is their background? Just like I described earlier, when you try to account for this almost visceral rejection, well, they're not operating with all available information. And as a result, their paradigm is potentially obsolete, a little outmoded, and is not giving them, it's not providing them with the foundation for their argument that they think it does. And so I always try to bear that in mind, and especially when working with amateur enthusiasts, investigators, I take my position as an educator very seriously, and I try to use these as teaching moments. So when someone sends me something, a footprint, I don't go,
Yeah.
come on. I mean, sometimes I I have to admit, sometimes I might grow a little impatient after many times admonishing people, for example, to put a scale in the picture. Even if it's just a dollar bill, we all know that a dollar bill is 6 inches and 1/4 long. And so if a dollar bill is flat in the picture, then you've got a scale, not your boot. I actually chided one person because he stood next to it. How am I supposed to know what size your boot is? 2 weeks later, in the mail arrived his boots in a box. I go, come on. If you want these back, you better send the return postage because I'm not covering
Yeah.
it.
All right, we're at the top of the hour here. I'm gonna run
Yeah.
a break. It's about 7 minutes long, so if you need to refresh your
Okay.
coffee or drink, and we'll be
All
back
right.
right after the break. Thank you, sir.
This is Dark Matter News. I'm Joshua Stark. A team at the University of Toronto has reported what they call negative time in a quantum optics experiment. Physicists led by Daniela Angulo and Ephraim Steinberg used ultra-cold rubidium atoms and finely tuned laser pulses to measure how long photons spend exciting atoms. To their surprise, the average dwell time sometimes came out below zero, implying that, in a statistical sense, photons appeared to be leaving the atomic cloud before they arrived. How does that work? In quantum mechanics, events aren't fixed in time but spread across a range of possibilities. When measuring the group delay, the effective transit time of light through a medium, these researchers found instances where the calculated delay was negative. In plain terms, a hypothetical quantum clock would tick backwards under certain conditions. But our experiment observing that photons could make atoms seem to spend a negative amount of time in the excited state is up, Steinberg wrote in a post on X about the study, which was uploaded to archive on September the 5th and is now awaiting peer review. Co-author Josiah Sinclair explains that the effect stems from quantum superposition. A photon may interact with an atom or pass straight through, and until measured, it effectively does both. Sometimes the calculation yields a minus value for the excitation time, a direct consequence of how weak measurements and group delay work in quantum theory. The SETI Institute has announced a major partnership with SkyMapper, a decentralized global astronomy network. This collaboration will provide real-time, continuous astronomical data to scientists, educators, and enthusiasts worldwide. Through programs like LaserSETI, CAMS, and Unistellar, users will be able to send observation requests and contribute data to a secure blockchain-verified global database, ensuring transparency and accuracy. SkyMapper will also give SETI access to its massive data archive for research, AI training, and scientific analysis. Key features of the partnership include 24/7 global sky monitoring, real-time data sharing, and community-driven discovery, inviting participation from citizen scientists around the world. This is Dark Matter News.
The CC Radio Solar is a small digital portable radio that is successful as an emergency radio, but the form and format function invite you to use it daily. Placed in a sunny window, it's perfect for the morning news. Audio is a surprise. It's accurate, pleasing, and has two modes: a miser mode to conserve battery power in a true emergency, and a high power mode for an even better audio experience. Reception is good for the size. The almost brick-sized depth and unique UV-resistant rubber perimeter is concave on the bottom, which makes it inherently stable. The flashlight is above average in brightness and color because of the selected high-quality LED. The hand crank folded and inlaid on in the back is the only visible clue that it's an emergency radio. To get your CC Radio Solar, call 1-800-552-8863. Once again, that's 1-800-552-8863. Or visit us on the web at www.ccrane.com. That's www.ccrane.com.
Whispers in the silence, shadows in the night, stories that they tell of beings from the light. In the dark they come alive, taking souls away underneath the starry veil where truth and dreams decay.
A flash of light, then a body goes still. Voices echo softly, bending to their will. Sleepers in their rooms, caught in a trance. A moment of sweet terror, an unspoken dance. Memories erased like dust in the breeze. What happened in that hour? Oh, they beg and they plead. Emotional scars that run so deep. Waking in the daylight, yet unable to sleep. Taken by the stars, I'm lost in the haze. Caught between reality and a cosmic maze.
right, we're back with Dr. Meldrum, and I had another question. You've analyzed the Skookum cast and other evidence. Is there any
Mhm.
particular piece of evidence that you can consider the most compelling?
Well, for me, again, coming at it uh, with my experience, my frame of reference, focused particularly on adaptations for bipedal walking, and particularly the foot. The footprint evidence embodies, for me, the most compelling evidence, especially the composite. I've got nearly 300, as you mentioned in the introduction, over 300 footprints attributed to relic hominoids, not only Sasquatch, but Asian counterparts of Sasquatch, also the Russian Almas that may be a relic Neanderthal. We've got the Orang Pendek, which may be a relic Australopithecine, and so on, even some other possibilities. So the the story that the footprints tell is an extremely compelling one, especially to those who can appreciate the evidence. And that's part of it. I mean, to really appreciate and understand. Um, and appreciate means much more than it just occurred to me because I I teach human gross anatomy to graduate physical therapy students, and I used to sometimes tell the students, you need to appreciate the architecture of the muscle. You need to appreciate the insertions, their positions, and the nature of the connective tissue. What's the disposition of the tendon, and so forth. You need to appreciate this. And they go, finally, a student says, Dr. Meldrum, what do you mean when you say appreciate? And I'm not going to be able to rattle it off here from memory, but it has a significant meaning that ties in closely with careful observation and the noting of detail and so on, and appreciate and understanding the significance of relationship and so on. Kind of along the lines of comprehending, but some more subtle meanings as well. So when I laid that out for them, then they started to realize, that when the instructions in the dissection guide said to appreciate this or that, it didn't just mean, to be grateful for it. It meant to comprehend it in all of its details. So, in order to appreciate the footprint evidence, it takes more than a single picture, a single cast in front of you. Um, Again, those can convey a very static impression of the impression, to make a pun there. It it's important that you have the variety within an individual, between individuals, between regions, between different potential types of relic hominoids to understand. And that's what's so amazing. You mentioned the Skookum cast. When it was found, it was quite sensational. I mean, a body imprint is a rare privilege, a rare opportunity. And a lot of people don't really understand the circumstances or what the skookum cast is. They've heard an elk wallow or a mud bath, or you got to realize again that these soils tend to be very clay because of the fine particulate nature of the sediment. When they're wet, it's not like, I mean, if they're moistened, they have a very clay consistency, and so we'll pick up, because of the very fine particulate nature of the substrate, we'll pick up fine details, details that are nearly on the order of the scale of the particle size. So that's how you get skin ridge detail or other skin texture, the kind of orange peel of skin that has pores, or the hair striations of hairy skin, like as the Sasquatch seems to have quite a lot of
Yes, sir.
hair covering its body.
Yeah.
So the Skookum cast was fascinating because this creature had apparently reclined to sample and enjoy the fruit baits that were left on the edge, at the edge of a puddle. So what we had was a large depression in the middle of a turnabout on the side of a Forest Service road. That puddle had shrunk, the water seeping into the ground, and as it did, it left behind a halo, so to speak, a circumference of very moist clay soil. So the creature and the investigators had chucked the remains of that day's bait, some apples and a couple of cantaloupes, I think is what they said, and this or that, onto the mud there near the puddle. So this creature had apparently approached that fruit and then had reclined, resting on one forearm and on its butt rolling onto its hip as it pushed with its heel to reach over and grab a piece of fruit, which it then proceeded to kind of process. Sometimes these apples have very, very tough rinds, tough peelings, and they're not the preferred part, especially if it's a big apple. The inner meat of the apple is what's attractive. And they'll
Yeah.
bite off the peeling and let it drop. So there was a little pile of discarded peelings in a sort of triangular shape, which if you reconstructed the imprint properly, seemed to be right between the thighs,
Yeah.
just below the crotch. Well, what was stunning, I mean, it was very easy for me to look at this, and people, I get so tired of the naive and superficial criticisms that are leveled, because the very first thing we did, um, uh, Owen Caddy had uh, had printed a large rollout formatted color image of the imprint itself in the ground and the resulting cast. And we went to game parks and zoos. Here in Pocatello, we have a zoo that only hosts endemic species. And so with no exotics, so there's no monkey house or anything, but there's a big paddock that has bison, pronghorn antelope, deer, elk. And we went to those keepers and rolled these things out and said, "Have you ever seen anything like this?" And they go, "Well, yeah, of course. They're all over in the paddock out there where these animals lie down." And I said, "Okay, but does it look just like this?" "Well, these are a little different," they'd say. And so we would go out there and look at some of these. Well, the number one biggest difference is, as you start looking at the details of the anatomy, there's some suggestive similarities, but there's more differences than similarities. And the most revealing difference is there are no hoof prints underneath the body mass when it was getting up or lying down. If it were an elk,
Yeah.
that's the only thing that would be big enough to really to and in that region common enough to be likely candidate. Um, there were elk prints associated with the quote wallow, with that turnabout,
Mhm.
but they crossed over at the edge, not even found within the perimeter as I remember. It's been a while since I've looked at it, of the imprint. You can't just levitate and bring your legs underneath you off a few feet from the center of mass. You've got to bring your legs under the center of mass, plant your hooves, and stand up. It's just that simple. And they weren't doing that. But what was interesting is when Rick Knoll went to the Seattle Zoo and happened to catch the ape house, the ape enclosure, at a time when the keepers were feeding them some apples, of all things. And he videoed this female in exactly the posture that I had reconstructed. If you look at my book, basically I got down on the floor and put myself in the position that I envisioned that would correlate with the impressions, and had one of my graduate students take several Polaroids, and then we shipped that off to the artist, and he used that as the basis for reconstructing what a Sasquatch might have looked like, creating the Skookum imprint. And it was exactly how this gorilla was situated, the exact posture.
Yeah.
And on the video, you can see her dig in her heel, reach across with the arm that isn't supporting the body weight, take an apple. There was a big pile of them. And then what she would do is she would bite a piece, let the peeling, the thick peeling, fall between her legs, and set that bitten apple on the side, making a second pile of apples that she had marked as hers, basically. But the exact same accumulation of peels right there between her legs, the same thrusting in of the heel in a similar fashion with the skookum imprint. The imprint of the heel is so distinctive that you can see the Achilles tendon, the calcaneal tendon. You can see the deep hollow in front of the tendon because of the displacement from the shin bone, the tibia, due to the elongation of the heel bone. Okay, and I don't mean to wax too technical here, but the point is the anatomy is there. Once again, the anatomy is there for those who have eyes to see it and understand it. And it fits our model of the Sasquatch foot, a central part of which is the elongated heel. Grover had drawn attention, Dr. Krantz had drawn attention to this way back. And and unfortunately, he didn't state it in the best way, rather than simply, I mean, he was trying to describe the fact that there was greater distance between the tendon and the shin bone. And in so attempting, he said the ankle was shifted forward. Well, that got all kinds of pushback from people like David Daglin, Dr. David Daglin. You can't move the ankle. Well, no, you can't technically move the ankle, but you can, by elongating the heel bone, thereby increasing leverage, you have effectively changed the relative position of the ankle to the overall foot length, which in layman's terms you might express you've moved the ankle forward on the foot. And so all of the jibber jabber, that's being kind about that came from Dagland against that was just baseless. It was
Yeah.
just absolutely inane. And I keep catching myself using that word a lot in these situations, but
Yeah.
I
I mean, to
can't
me,
come up
that,
with a better one that's not too offensive. But anyway, um,
to me, that's
so the
pretty
scoop
compelling
cast,
evidence. So,
yeah, at one time, John Green, who was so impressed with this, I mean, he thought this was the end all piece of evidence.
yeah.
How could you account for this in any other way? But I mean, this was much more to him than the possibility of someone putting on stompers and traipsing around. So convinced was he, so enamored was he with this piece of evidence, he was willing to finance a little excursion on my part. He wanted me to rent a truck and to take. They were already making very high quality fiberglass and resin replicas of the both positives and negatives of the cast,
Mhm.
and wanted me to take these around on tour, so to speak, and discuss them with various scholars at universities across the country. And I said, well, John, if I was going to commit to that kind of an effort, I wouldn't take such an obscure piece of evidence. I mean, there are a handful of people that will appreciate this, will look at it with an open mind. But for most people, even the scholars, it's going to look like a piece of modern art you might see on the wall of your dentist's waiting room, outside his office. It's it's going to be completely lost on me. If I was going to do that, I would take a selection, much like I do when I go on my speaking engagements, take a selection of footprints with the provenience provided and illustrating important historical discoveries and anatomical features that were revealed and the remarkable consistency of the anatomy, the basis of the ichnotaxonomy, and the dynamics, variability expressed in some of these cases. I said that would have a much more impactful uh, result, I think, than just taking the skookum cast around as this oddity that most people will not understand, not appreciate.
Yeah.
But it never happened. I mean, it was not realistic, nor did I have the time really to undertake such a venture. Quite honestly, it would be very challenging. It would be tough to approach. I mean, there are some of my colleagues who expressed interest, and especially later here of late now, but at that time especially, there was a lot of resistance. There was there were other, like the stories of Hieronymus and the Patterson Gimlin film, and other people that were coming out just making a mockery. Rick Dyer, for example, and his ridiculous little mannequin with teeny weeny weeny. And I only point that out because Rick set himself up entirely. He during one of his uh, postings, one of his YouTube videos, he lit my book afire, doused it with lighter fluid.
Oh my goodness.
Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, lit it afire, had it blazing, had a little entourage of his cronies cheering him on, and then as it burned down, to a crisp, he then literally whips it out. That's being generous. He exposes himself and urinates on it to extinguish the fire.
Oh my Lord.
And it was quite picturesque, right down to the last drop, extinguishing that last little pink flame. But I joked when you see when you see his little sideshow mannequin, whoever put it together for him, I don't know what served as the model, but the male equipment is about the size of your little pinky finger, and and so I couldn't help maybe but wonder if maybe Rick was the model for that, after seeing him on his YouTube video. Oh, that's bound to get a reaction from him, but that's good. I mean, he deserves to be piled upon a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
talk about sophomoric behavior. It was just, I couldn't believe. But the problem was people, get distracted by that. He probably laughed all the way to the bank. I know that he claims he made quite a little fistful of money from his little sideshow, carnival sideshow. So anyway, how do we get onto that? Oh, the
I don't
most
know.
compelling evidence. The most compelling is the footprints. For me, it's got to be the footprints first and foremost. The Patterson Gimlin film, early on, I have to admit, I was a little reluctant to put too many eggs in that basket, just because I didn't want it to feel like the pyramid was upside down, with the apex pivoting on this one data point.
Mhm.
Although, I mean, it's much more than one data point. The film, that's the thing. The film is such a rich collection of insight and information. Again, if you have the wherewithal to appreciate it. And see what's happened now as time has elapsed. Things have continued to evolve and to change. Paradigms have shifted and taken shape in anthropology. And so, what in 1967 struck the experts as being incongruence, contradiction, inconsistencies throughout the film that didn't align with their vision
Yeah.
of what an early bipedal hominin or a bipedal primate of any type might look like. Now it's spot on. Here we are 55 plus years later, and they couldn't have gotten it better if they'd had a time machine and jumped forward, 50 years, and then looked at and used as an example a robust Australopithecine. What we see on that film screen is exactly, with the exception of the size, and we can account for that with radiation into northern latitudes at a time the mid to late Pleistocene, when many species of mammal were expressing gigantism as an adaptation to more extreme temperate climate fluctuation. Sasquatch, in my opinion, is the primate vicar of that megafauna, Pleistocene megafauna guild, and or guilds, plural. And so what you see on that screen is now exactly what we would envision. I tell my audiences, if I were to write an introductory text on physical anthropology, human evolution, and I wanted an illustration of the generalized adaptation of early bipedal hominin, one that walked on flat, flexible feet, had not yet evolved an arch, had not yet expressed the tremendous reduction in the musculoskeletal robusticity, that Homo sapiens exhibits, that had a brain that was barely bigger than a chimpanzee's relative to body mass, et cetera, and even other adaptations, unexpected adaptations of combinations of craniofacial proportions and dentition, so forth. The lack of projecting canines, for example, the huge premolars and molars, which then without those interlocking canines, you can grind to a greater degree side to side, what's called the phase two of the chewing cycle. Anyway, if there wasn't the stigma, there wasn't the notoriety already attached to that image, I could take that frame 352 and stick it in my textbook, and it would serve the purpose just fine. Say to illustrate a Paranthropus boisei in East Africa 800,000 years ago. Isn't that amazing? How
Yeah.
how could he, there's no way Patterson could get that right. If he had a coach, if he had someone in the wings, like somebody kind of mentoring his efforts to hoax something, they would never guide him in those directions because they would want what was on the screen to be acceptable to the scientific community. If they were trying to hoax him, you don't do a hoax with the intent of everyone coming forward saying, "Oh, that's obviously a hoax because ABC." You would anticipate the ABC and address it. But at that time, there was no one who had any inkling of what ABC, even the experts at that time. See, they were expecting one thing and then instead encountered something quite different. So, um, yeah, I mean, so anyway, my point being, the Patterson-Gimlin film is also, I mean, it is the benchmark of photographic evidence. Everything else pales by comparison. It falls short. I mean, there are a few good ones, a few interesting ones, both action and still, but nothing. I mean, just lightning really struck once in that case. I would love to see it strike again. I really would. But in this day and age with AI and with all the technologies and instrumentation and so forth, it's always suspect. So
The thing I'm
it
glad,
really,
the thing I like they did best about that Patterson video was stabilizing.
sure, yeah. I mean, that was a real boon when we did our project. Bill Munns and Isaac Tien and I, and if people are interested in that, there's published paper right now. There's another one in the works in the Relict Hominoid Inquiry, which you can Google and find an online open access peer, which you mentioned in my introduction, a peer-reviewed refereed journal. And there's also an episode of The Proof is Out There with Tony Harris or Harrison. I always get his name mixed up. But that episode is really good, and it shows our efforts at optimizing. I don't like to use the word enhance because enhancement leaves sort of open the possibility that you have altered or added information. Like you see the advertisements for the revitalization of old Civil War portraits. The line goes across the portrait, and emerges with this sharp, crisp, colorful image. Well, that information isn't there. It's extrapolating. It's adding. It's doing things that are within the likely parameters, but from a scientific perspective, you're adding information that wasn't there. Optimization, on the other hand, tries to present the evidence, the data that are there in the best way possible, so that all the information there can be appreciated. And as you point out, stabilization is an important part. So there might not be a huge revelation, but as I point to anatomical details, the observer can see and can recognize what I'm describing because it's nice and stabilized and smooth and maybe slowed down or maybe looped a couple of times, but the image is easier to apprehend, to comprehend than it was when it was bouncing all over the screen and it's got streaks and scratches and so forth. That copy might not be a very good copy. But see, we combined multiple, sometimes more than a dozen copies into a single image, frame after frame after frame. And so that tends to average out and emphasize the real facts and the artifacts, the scratches, the blemishes, the fading, the motion blur. That becomes the outlier, which is diluted away and leaves you with a much fuller, richer, more vivid image, now stabilized and played at the proper film speed. So you can also appreciate the kinematics of the walk much, much better. So we could talk for hours just about the various anatomies, the various kinematics of the walk, the associated footprints, and the kinematics of the foot. See, my interpretation, again, that's why I rankle when people say, oh, well, the mid-tarsal break, that's just your interpretation. That's just your opinion. Well, it goes further than that. It's a conclusion drawn upon lots and lots and lots of data, not just what's on the film, but years and years and years of the study of human and non-human primate walking and footprints and so forth. But in addition, that interpretation of the footprint is confirmed by watching the track maker leave the track. So when I talk about the midfoot flexibility and the heel coming up first and the foot supporting weight through the entire forefoot and causing displacement, and this, that, and the other, you can watch that happening before your own eyes on the film. You don't have to take my word for it. I'm just pointing it out to you and telling you what it means in terms of the kinematics and biomechanics and comparative evolutionary adaptation. But you can see it. You can see it yourself. There's no quibbling over the fact that it's happening. And then when I bring in dozens and dozens and dozens of other footprint examples, this is the one that blew me out of the water. Two. I won't go into detail on both of them, but I made a trip to China, was able to look at Yeren footprints, an excellent example. And I'm absolutely confident in the credibility because, unbeknownst to the person who made those tracks, they're almost identical to the Titmus cast from the Patterson-Gimlin film site. The best example of the pressure ridge of all 10 that he cast on the site. But there are others, many others of that 10, eight of the 10, in fact, also show a mid-tarsal pressure ridge in varying degrees.
Yeah.
Well, then I had a chance to go and look at the 1958 Jerry Crew footprint cast, the first plaster cast made in the United States. And when you see that picture with Jerry Crew with his crew cut hair and little spectacles, it's a very distinctive print. If people have seen it, they'll remember from that description. He's holding up a cast. Mm-hmm. Well, it was taken with a journalist's camera, with a big silver dish and a blue globe inside, a flash bulb, You remember those days?
Yes, sir.
And it gives a very stark, harsh flash. When you see it evidenced by the strong shadow behind Jerry Crew. He looks almost like a cardboard cutout, there for a photo to be taken. Well, likewise, the footprint, because of that harsh, strong front lighting, it looks very flat. Okay. Well, and that fits right into the narrative. These are just made by stompers that are carved out of, a plank, 8-inch wide plank.
Yeah, I've seen
Well,
pictures of those.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So you can, well, I had the chance to visit Jerry Crew's, one of his sons, John, who is the current custodian of the original cast, which still exists. And he has it nicely wired into a shadow box with some other, the newspaper article and other things to illustrate it. Well, he was gracious enough to let me unwire it and lift it carefully out so that I could take some photographs from various close-up angles and so on. The first thing that jumped out at me when I saw that cast is it's not flat. It has topography. And guess what? It has a pressure ridge in the exact location, proportionately, and in the distinctive orientation. The sort of speed bump is a slightly canted a little bit with the lateral side just a little bit forward because the two joints that create that flexion, that axis of flexion, are slightly offset. The talonavicular is on the inside of the foot, and it's back just a hair from the calcaneocuboid, which is on the outside of the foot. So the axis of the speed bump is inclined just ever so slightly upward and outward, and it shows that perfectly. So the first plaster cast made in the United States shows a pressure ridge, documents the mid-tarsal flexibility of the flat, flexible nature of the Sasquatch foot. And example after example, including totally unrelated, totally unbeknownst to the discoverer in China, a set of right and left prints from China, from Hubei province, the Shenanjia Nature Reserve, cast by Mr. Yuan, a park ranger who had a sighting of a orangish, burnt brownish Yaren sunning himself, sleeping on a rock outcrop in the sun, whereupon Mr. Yuan yelled across to it, and he thought it was a bear, but instead of a snouted face with ears on top of its head, it turned and looked at him with a flat face and ears on the side, flat on the side of its head, covered with this hair, and slid off and walked away on two legs. So to his credit, he hustled after it and tracked it, found where it had squatted beside a spring, as I recall his description, and eventually retrieved some materials to make plaster casts of a right and a left. And as it had squatted, it came up, not on the ball of the foot like we would because of our arched foot structure, but it flexed across the transverse tarsal joint. Just the heel came up, the forefoot took up the weight, and that caused some of the soil to be displaced back into the heel impression, what was still there. So anyway, that, people ask for a smoking gun, short of a body. And I acknowledge that physical evidence is a prerequisite. We need to find a body, a jaw, a tooth, DNA, a novel reproducible DNA sequence, distinct DNA sequence. But short of that, as so many of my predecessors who could also appreciate the footprints, Dr. Krantz, Dr. Napier, well, he wasn't a doctor, but Ivan Sanderson, it was the footprint evidence. Napier said, he concluded, there's got to be something out there because something's leaving these footprints. You've got to account for it. If you're going to dismiss this as a hoax, then you've got to explain how we have 100 years worth of footprint descriptions, encounters, and casts since 1958. So what, half a century, more than half a century of footprints that all, not all, I mean, there are hoaxes. There's no question things get hoaxed. There are things that are not footprints that get cast. They're just potholes or or are human footprints or are bear footprints, BEAR. But there is a remark. I mean, those are the exception. My experience with 300 plus footprint casts in my lab, the obvious hoaxes, the obvious misidentifications are the exception. There's a remarkable, at least in the documented footprint cast collections.
Yeah.
Uh,
How
so,
many how many different countries have they found evidence of Sasquatch or Yeti, whichever?
yeah, well, this is interesting. There, and a quick preface. I was in an airport traveling and decided on a rare occasion to pick up a magazine that caught my attention in the little shop, and it had an article on the imperiled status of Asian tigers. But what caught my attention was a map. The map had the historic distribution of Asian tigers, all across the old world, and the current fragmented refugia that now still harbor tigers. And, just a small fraction, but in this case, highlighted in red. Well, what caught my attention was I had, since my experience with the Yaren tracks and, I've been to the Caucasus Mountains and firsthand examined footprint casts that were there and photos of footprints that were witnessed by an entire village. Um, Interviewed, talked to the sort of town naturalist that was the professional guide and outdoorsman. And anyway, the point is, I had I had over the years collected examples because obviously Sasquatch did not evolve here. It evolved in Asia and then expanded its range into North America, as did so many other species of mammal. 75% of the native mammals in North America can trace their origins back to Asia. 75%. People don't appreciate the traffic across. And it wasn't always a frozen Arctic wasteland. It was often a verdant blanket of mixed deciduous coniferous forest all the way from China to, well, to southeast, Alabama. There are plant species, correlated plant species, and animals. We've got fossils of little red pandas, the little raccoon. If a little raccoon-sized panda bear can make it across, well, make it that even that, see, even that choice of words, if it can expand its range through available habitat, in other words, it doesn't have to lean into the blizzard and brave the whiteout.
Mhm.
It has habitat that it's familiar with that now is unbroken, continuous, stretching across the land bridge. And if it can, we find its fossils in Washington and down in southeastern United States. I can't remember what state. It was Alabama or North Carolina or somewhere. There are red panda teeth that have been found from the Pleistocene. Why not an 800-pound gorilla
Yeah.
with that's bipedal and can locomote quite efficiently? I mean, it doesn't have to even. See, this is another thing. People think that, well, you've got to be this migratory creature in order to expand into new continents. No, you just have to, each generation just has to extend its range a little bit into the available habitat. It's like, and it's worth repeating. One of my colleagues, and one that takes a very negative view of this whole subject matter, wrote a book about on the subject of paleoanthropology, and one chapter on Homo erectus. He dubbed it the migrating hominin because, and it was denoting the expansion of this hominin that has kind of attained a new grade of evolution and a degree of bipedalism and longer legs that it could march across Asia and end up in Southeast Asia. And I said, do this exercise for me. You look up the distance from a site in East Africa to a site with Homo erectus in Southeast Asia, and then compare the dates, and then divide that time span by that distance, and how many miles each year, or break it down to each 10 years. So each generation, how many miles does each generation have to move? And it works out to be like between 6 to 9 miles. I mean, that's your kids leaving home, finding a mate, moving to the other side of the mountain to get out of mom and dad's hair, or vice versa, and start and building your own hut. And then the next 10 years, your kids do the same thing. And there, it doesn't require any migratory behavior. It doesn't require any locomotor adaptations for long distance walking or running. It's just a matter. I mean, we don't see those in the red panda, do we? I mean, if people would just stop and think for a minute, that's why, I shouldn't laugh at them, but I mean, it's just the argument is so inane when you think about it,
Yeah.
because especially when they use that then to throw up in front of a rational discussion of other hypotheses, other evidence, like the expansion of a bipedal giant ape like Gigantopithecus, maybe, or a robust Australopithecine gone giant as it spread across Asia and made its way into North America. It doesn't require packing your little knapsack on the end of your stick and hopping a freight train. It's not like that romantic scenario of exploring what's over the horizon. They didn't care what's over the horizon. They just cared where their next meal was, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's just one. Now I've lost my train of thought. Where we got started down that path. Can you remember if I lost you too?
I, I don't know. We changed directions in there in my brain,
I know I'm notorious
but
for
it's
that.
perfectly fine. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
right.
Uh,
Well, we cover some good stuff.
have you ever encountered any vocalizations or thermal imaging that would lead you to
Oh
point?
yes,
Yeah.
on several occasions. I mean, I've heard everything ranging from um, a whistle, a very distinctive whistle, almost like whistling through your teeth, but not really. I get more the impression it's a whistle that's originating down in their throat,
Yeah.
like a bird call. And I've also heard what I would describe as a banshee call, a scream, a long distance scream, which is more of I mean, not like a blood curdling, a woman being attacked scream, but rather a long drawn out yell, howl, but higher pitched, than not like the roar of a lion or something. Or it was pretty dramatic. I mean, it was quite some distance because it had a very trailing off effect. Um, I've heard what I think was tooth popping, where they bite down hard.
Uh-huh.
Because at first, my first thought was it was two rocks clacking. And I thought, well, that just really seems weird. Why would it bother to pick up two rocks? I mean, there were rocks in the vicinity where this occurred. There were lots of cobbles from a stream. We were actually adjacent to an old stream bed, but then I read, and so at first I thought that's what it must have been. They picked up, and it was responded to by a second one on the other side of our camp.
Yeah.
So there were clearly two, and one was signaling to the other, that, I'm here and blah, blah, blah. Well, then I read John Bindernagel's book, and he describes an eyewitness encounter in which the witness had a very clear view of the creature as it was retreating, and then it glanced over its shoulder, pivoted at the waist a bit, and glanced back, and as it looked at them, it clacked its teeth. She said she saw it bite clack, clack, clack. And it's interesting because bears do that
Mhm.
when they're nervous or anxious or intimidating. Gorillas, chimps, baboons do that. Baboons will yawn, this big gaping yawn to display their wares. They're putting their arsenal on display. And then as they terminate the yawn, they will bite down hard a couple, two or three times, cluck, 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 with their molars. And so I'm more comfortable with the notion that that's what was happening. They were clacking their teeth.
Yeah.
But I don't know for sure. I mean, that's just in that case, that is an opinion because it's not based on well, it's based indirectly on some comparative data, put it that way. It just seems more likely than the manipulation of rocks. Although, now having said that, there was a very interesting location.
Uh-oh, did I lose you? I lost him.
Yeah, I apologize. My laptop started to slip, and as I reached up to stabilize it, my thumb came down on the power button.
Oh boy.
Unfortunate. So it just cut it off. So let's see. We were saying,
Vocalizations.
right. And so having said that, I thought it perhaps a little unlikely that they were using their hands to manipulate these rocks because there's reason to believe based on handprints, based on the knuckle prints that I have a copy of the originals of that the thumb is not as dexterous, not as opposable as ours. And so that fine manipulation, but grabbing a rock is not, that's a power grip. That's not a precision grip. And the reason I qualify it is because there's a really, really fascinating instance of a nest site that was discovered on the Olympic Peninsula. The Olympic Project became aware of it when a timber cruiser was actually surveying out timber for harvest, and he stumbled on way back beyond a gated road and probably 3 miles off the road. It's a real challenge to get there. I've been there a couple of times, and it's quite a hike and bushwhacking through some dense undergrowth. But anyway, the point is there was a series of nests. Next to one of the nests were two cobbles, presumably retrieved from the stream, which was below down a 300-foot steep slope. And there was signs of percussion. If you took two rocks had a normal kind of finish with a dark color and you pound those together repeatedly, looked at where you pound, you'd see the points of percussion. You'd see the chips and the light color where it strikes. So they were found right next to one of the nests. One can't help but wonder, were those used to make a sound, to make an audible signal to someone else, to another group, another band, to other individuals converging on this spot? There were multiple nests. I kind of think it was a birthing event because there was evidence of small elevated nest that when I saw it, I mean, the first I couldn't help but immediately think it looked just like a bassinet. And because we rarely find nests like this, and so that begs the question, why this set of nests? Well, it's almost, since they're not showing up regularly, it must be an unusual circumstance that has dictated this kind of congress of nests. And what could be more likely, perhaps, than a female in labor giving birth and then taking, benefit from the companionship and support of some of her conspecifics in that region, that location. Interesting case. But so
Yeah.
um, so I've heard, some things like that as far as my experience with vocalizations. The best person to talk about vocalizations now is David Ellis, who is a member of the Olympic Project, and he's done some really educated himself, sort of self-tutored, but he interacts with many chat groups, professional bioacoustics chat groups, and he's gotten some online training, I believe, and studied widely. And so he can create the sonograph. So you can quantify and visualize a vocalization and make very precise comparisons on the basis of those metrics with, a library, an archive of known sounds and other unknown, indeterminate identity sounds. So it's a fascinating area. He's in the process of writing a book, and I'm in the process of upgrading my chapter for my book. So I've been picking his brain and, not to steal too much of his thunder at this point, but I've also been badgering him to write a paper for the relic hominoid inquiry, summarizing the cases he's worked on so far. And again, it's just like with the footprints. If you have the wherewithal to appreciate those sonograms and the distinctions and what a biological organism can and can't create with their vocal tract, then you're left with the same statement. Something is making those vocalizations that aren't readily attributable to any common form of wildlife out there. So you got to account for that.
Yeah, we've been out about 2 hours. Can you go a little longer?
I'm about spent.
Yeah, are you?
I almost didn't get back on with you, but I didn't want to leave you hanging.
Yes,
I
sir.
thought you could wrap it up and give my goodbyes, but I've about talked myself out. 2 hours
Alrighty,
is about
sir.
my limit.
I had some more questions. Maybe in the future we could have you back
Yes.
in a few months
Yes.
and continue the conversation.
I'd be
'Cause
happy to do that.
I
I'd be happy to
appreciate
do
you, sir. Well, I will let you get some rest, and I will shut things down here. But like I say, it's been an honor to have you here, and I enjoyed this topic very much.
Well, thank you. As you can see, it doesn't take a lot of prodding to get me jabbering on. So there's just so much. It's hard to do it justice in short sound bites. And so as opposed to the brief interviews or brief appearances on the television documentaries, these formats give us an opportunity to discuss in much greater depth. And so I appreciate the opportunity. And I hope your audience finds it informative and interesting.
I believe they will. And
Good.
well, I will let you get some rest, and then I'll contact you later on, maybe in a
All
month,
right.
a few
All
months, having you back
Okay.
on. Thank
All
you,
right.
sir.
Good night.
Good night.
Researchers have unveiled groundbreaking contact lenses that let wearers see in the dark, even with their eyes closed. Developed by a team at the University of Science and Technology of China and reported in Cell, these innovative lenses use up-conversion nanoparticles embedded in soft polymer. These particles absorb infrared light, which our eyes normally can't detect, and convert it into visible colors like red, green, and blue. During human trials, participants successfully identified flickering infrared signals and gauged their direction. Surprisingly, perception improved when eyes were closed. The eyelid filters out visible light, but allows more near-infrared through. Earlier tests on mice confirmed infrared vision too, with brain scans showing activity in visual regions. These lenses don't need batteries, and they're worn like regular contacts, making them far less bulky than conventional night vision goggles. Lead scientist Professor Yan Chu says the tech holds promise not only for nighttime visibility in fog or rescue missions, but also for helping those with color blindness by translating visible wavelengths into hues they can distinguish. There are still challenges. Current versions struggle to detect low natural infrared or resolve sharp details, so researchers are now improving nanoparticle efficiency and clarity. That's it for Dark Matter News. Catch up with us on the Midnight Frequency Facebook page. From Memphis, Tennessee, I'm Joshua Stark.
Welcome back. Thanks to everyone that tuned in this evening with our guest, Mr. Meldrum. Next week, our guest will be Jason McLeod. Topic will be paranormal and spiritual realms. We look forward to seeing you. That'll be next Friday, June 27th, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Jason McLeod. See everyone next week. Until then, explore the unknown.